movement disorder neurologists, researchers, patients, caregivers, everyone. So, so excited to sort of try something new. And thanks PMD Alliance for continuing to host. We're excited for this series. Ben and I got to know each other, well last year, kind of talking about advocacy, activism. What are the things that remain untouched in terms of needs and gaps for Parkinson's patients, people living with Parkinson's? I think this weekend we've had some discussion about whether people should be called patients, people living with Parkinson's. Maybe we can even get into that on this chat today, because I think there's a lot of ideas and controversies, and I'm happy if the people are happy. So, so love to hear what people think. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to Ben to teach us about why he picked Jon Stamford to join us today. I've noticed Jon's work over a number of different venues. He's done some cool videos on Twitter. He's got some really controversial thoughts. Researcher, patient, advocate, all of the above, global mind leader, and influencer. I love that word. So I think without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to Ben, who influences me on a daily basis in terms of my thinking.
Thank you, Indu, and hello, everybody. Great to be with you here again today. I have the pleasure of introducing you to Dr. Jon Stamford, who I'll bring on in a moment. I met Jon in a rather auspicious way, I would say. It was about 4 years ago, almost exactly to the day. I think it was a couple of weeks from now, 4 years ago, when a friend of mine, Gaynor, brought me to a cricket field or pitch or whatever you call it. And there I saw this esteemed gentleman who was standing there watching this game of cricket being played by a couple friends of his. Now, for me, this was a very alien experience. I didn't know the first thing about cricket. To this day, I still don't know the first thing about cricket, despite Jon's attempts to educate me. But we shared a good long talk that afternoon, and ever since then, we've kind of kept up a pretty robust and I think pretty entertaining conversation for the both of us. And he's another person that's really helped inspire me along the way, helped educate me, frankly, about this journey that I've been on, and somebody that I look to whenever I have some big questions about the world or when I'm facing a decision point in my own kind of journey here. So yeah, I find him very inspiring. I think you will as well. So without further ado, I'll pass the mic over to Jon and just ask Jon if you could quickly, although take as much time as you want, I guess, walk us through the journey that you've been on and what kind of, in some sense, brings you to where you are today.
Well, many thanks, Ben, for that introduction. It's a fairly substantial introduction to live up to, I think. Certainly, I would say that I gain as much from conversations with you as you do from me. In fact, if anything, I feel the opposite way around. I think I gain more, as it were. My background is slightly unusual. I started out as a research neuroscientist. I did a first degree in pharmacology, a PhD in neuropharmacology, and then a DSc in neuroscience. And my interest was always the basal ganglia, and particularly the role of dopamine in the basal ganglia. And for, let me see, something like 13 years, I headed a research team looking at the role of dopamine in the basal ganglia, how it can be modulated, and in the context of Parkinson's and how these things could be changed. So very much focusing on the minutiae. And then in 2006, unfortunately, I was diagnosed with Parkinson's, completely out of the blue, if I'm honest. I didn't pick up the symptoms at all, although I should have done. And that has very, very much changed my attitude. Up to that point, I said I was very much an academic researcher. From there onwards, I was very much not an academic researcher and had to retrain. I remember my wife saying at the time, when I developed Parkinson's, she said, trust you to take your training just that little bit too far, which wasn't necessarily my way of seeing it, but I can see her perspectives. So from there onwards, I really felt that I resented the loss of a voice, I suppose, as a neuroscientist. So I had to develop a new voice as an advocate, and to make sure that even though I couldn't be conducting the research myself, that it would somehow continue along the right lines. So I felt very much that I had to kind of take up that role. So I became involved in advocacy. via the World Parkinson Congress and via Cure Parkinson's Trust principally, but also independently as an advocate as well. And I think that's always been my motif since then, has really been to try and get my thoughts across to patients, to drug companies, to academia. Really, that's, I suppose, in a nutshell, my background.
That's amazing. I love your background there. Your wall hanging and your tie as well. Your bow tie makes me think of many of my colleagues in neurology. So I think you've tied all of your background and your current situation well in sort of presenting yourself right now. But I wanted to ask you, you mentioned about, sort of having this early symptoms of Parkinson's and then getting diagnosed and sort of being shocked about. Do you think that you were so in the moment with your research that there was a delay in after you had symptoms to when you actually got diagnosed?
I think there very much was. It was quite an interesting time because I had many of the classic symptoms. It's certainly much slower walking than previous days, tired very quickly, and I had a tremor, and I managed to find ways of explaining away these symptoms without reaching the logical conclusion. I used to lecture to medical students and talk to them about Parkinson's and about what the basic symptoms were. So you would think you would recognize it yourself, but it's, I said it wasn't the case. I put the tremor down to maybe shouldn't have had that glass of whiskey the previous night, and the general bradykinesia I put down to just middle age. I thought this is what middle age is about. It's more dull. I remember very clearly the actual moment of diagnosis, because I went on to the GP with the general practitioner and general family doctor in American terms, with a frozen shoulder, which is, I see you nodding, and it's quite a classic symptom. A lot of people, I think, present with it. And I remembered saying to the GP, I said, I've got this problem with this frozen shoulder. And he said, that's fine, we'll give you a steroid injection for that. That'll take care of it. And I said, it's a real nuisance because it's affecting my handwriting. And I remember he had holding his pen literally above the page just to write a prescription for me. And I remember him very slowly and methodically putting the pen down, putting the lid back on the pen, and he turned to me and he said, do you think you should see a neurologist? And I said, yes, I think I probably should. And it was literally that moment of realization that it's as to what I knew instantly what he was thinking. And I remember leaving the room, and he never said anything. He just looked me in the eye and he said, unlucky, he said. And that was the end of our discussion on the matter. He referred me to a neurologist who confirmed the diagnosis. And by then I pretty much realized what it was myself. But I just simply thought, I ruled it out largely on the grounds of probability, that it's the likelihood of actually studying the condition and then developing it, I thought was so minuscule that it was improbable. So I fundamentally, I think, talked myself out of it for a long time.
One very early lesson that you instilled in me, and something that I think you're very much a living embodiment of in many ways, is the need to build bridges across the different stakeholders in this community. And the need to break people out of their silos so that scientists have more interactions with patients, and patients have more interactions with doctors, and doctors have more interactions with caregivers, and we need as many of these bridges as intact as possible. And there's a quote of yours that I often repeat that I just wanted to share with the rest of it, with the audience. Patients have to lead the agenda and be able to say to scientists, these are my priorities and these are the things that need addressing. The idea of scientists alone making the decisions about what they perceive to be Parkinson's is insane. If I think back to who I was before the diagnosis, I wouldn't trust myself to make those decisions. So I'd like you to kind of try to take a journey, if you would, back in time to when you were a scientist. And what would you say to yourself to kind of start creating those bridges earlier on, to get you, to motivate you to reach out to patient groups or to even neurologists, whatever it might be? What would it take for you to have actually done that? And I guess more to the point, what would be your advice to scientists today about creating those bridges and connecting with patient communities and connecting with these organizations?
That's an awfully big question, and it's in many parts as well. I think just from my own experience, I mean, I certainly had no connection with patients at all as an academic. I was very, and to be honest, I didn't really look for any either. I was actually focused very much on the minutiae, really, of neurotransmission, the ways in which cells communicate with each other, and the ways in which those circumstances were modified in illness, particularly Parkinson's. But so in that respect, I never really saw the need to see patients. Now, of course, the moment I became a patient, I saw it entirely differently. I more or less put the dopamine away in a drawer and kind of reconciled myself to having had 13 years of a life with dopamine, so to speak. I now had, well, hopefully many more as well, but years of life without dopamine. So essentially, I didn't see the need. Looking back now, as it were, I think I increasingly recognise the need for linkage between the different areas, and in particular, I think it does all come down to patients. I think if we look at healthcare generally, and this is perhaps overstating the case, but if we look at healthcare generally, under what circumstances does healthcare exist? Healthcare exists entirely for the benefit of patients. If you took pharmaceutical industry away, healthcare would still exist in a different form. If you took patients away, it wouldn't. There would be no such thing as healthcare, because there would be no need for it. Now, that's slightly simplistic, but it does draw the focus, I think, very much towards patients, and patients are better able to articulate what the patient experience is like, which may sound simple, but a good friend of mine put it very, very eloquently when I tried to explain to her the difficulties in passing this kind of information on. And she said, well, the problem is that with all conditions, but Parkinson's especially, she said, if you haven't got it, you don't get it, which is, I thought, a wonderful way of emphasizing those differences. But the real burden, I think, as I said, with everything being focused on the patients, of course, it also means that the burden falls on the patients to actually communicate their needs. And I think it's, I often used to say to neurologists, I spoke to a group of neurologists a couple of years back, and I said, the biggest problem is that we as patients, I said, we lie and you don't listen. And which was perhaps overstating the case, but it certainly got their attention at the time. And it's a case of trying to bridge that gap. And I don't have any magic bullet to provide a solution to that, but it does still come down to the fact that everything has to come from patients. Without patients being proactive, I don't think we'll make serious progress. That's probably a very waffly answer, really, to what was quite a long question.
No, I think that was really well stated. I mean, I think that, I'm not a research scientist, really. I'm not a basic scientist, but I went into medicine to help people. That was, when you ask people, I'm on interview panels for medical students and residents, and, everybody writes, about their granddad who had this, and they want to, solve this disease because they want to help people. And that's why people go into medicine. And at some point, it's interesting, during the medical training, you mentioned, lecturing to medical students. I think we have a very wide-based, group of very compassionate people that come in at the front end. And then somehow through the training, we sort of develop these sub specialists, and people get driven into these sort of silos almost. And people, I think Megan Duffy came on last week and said, I couldn't do this because I'm too empathetic or whatever. I couldn't do this, being a researcher because I'm not organized enough. And I think we've sort of put ourselves in these little pigeonholes and then stay in those pigeonholes. And we try to interact with people presumably that are in our pigeonholes. But I think at the end of the day, with something like Parkinson's that is so complex and takes so many sorts of parts of people's faculties and changes them, in the mind, the body, the spirit, and, so many other aspects of it. It's not just, a tremor. I think it really does require sort of a lot of types of people and not these just pigeonholes, just having these chats and really understanding the lived experience. And it would be important, I think, for us as educators too, to understand how do we keep that sort of focus on the patient and really why we went into medicine, when everything about the system at some point then changes. You go into practice and it's all about, how many people can you see in an hour? How much money can you bring in? How can we do this, and this, and save these much dollars? At the end of the day, then that's sort of the pressure. And I think a lot of then healthcare providers that really went into it for the right reasons either end up in that model or themselves end up having a lot of moral distress, honestly, about waking up in the morning, going into a system in which they have to provide care in which they're really not feeling like their, specific, hopes and dreams and purpose is really being valued. So I think, there's sort of a system issue. I think people change along the way and then people get disconnected in some ways. And I think that communicating about the realities of this is probably, part of the solution, hopefully. But what's your sense of what I just said?
I think that's very true. I think, as you say, the system, we have this utopian vision of medical training that said you have time to make complex diagnoses, differential diagnoses, and so forth. The reality of neurology in the UK, and I suspect it's very similar in the US and elsewhere, is that you have basically 15 minutes to get a complete history out of that patient, because often you won't necessarily see the same neurologist 2 times running, and certainly in London that's the case. So you have 15 minutes, and what's the first thing you ask the patient? How are you? What's the first thing the patient says to you? I'm fine. And do you think, and there'll be a little bit of small talk and chat at the beginning, so you knocked 2 or 3 minutes off your 15 minutes already. And you're doubtless aware that you've got to get all this information out of the patient. You've got to find out what they're taking, whether their medications change, a whole load of questions. And you've got to be able to write that up and make some notes for a letter to the patient's GP and to go to the patient as well, as often as not, which is going to take you a few minutes at the end of the session. So you have hardly any time to actually do all these detailed questions that you have in mind. And as you're saying, I think the difference between one's vision of neurology, for the sake of argument, at the start of your training and several years into it, I think it changes substantially. And also the other problem is that patients, as I'm sure you find, patients like to chat. And my father was a GP, and he was very much a diagnostician, but his partner wasn't. And the patients used to come in, they would ask the secretaries on the desk to see the doctor, and they would say, have you come for a chat, or do you want to know what's wrong with you? And depending on that, they would send the patient to one or other of the 2 doctors. But as I said, we do like to chat and build, and also we like to build a relationship with our neurologists as well, which is why it's frustrating in the context of London, and I'm sure elsewhere, when you see somebody completely different the following time, and you have to re-establish a rapport, and they've got to get all the same information out of you again, and we're all sat there drawing spirals for the 20th time in a row. It's all of that. So yeah, it is I think a challenge.
I'll keep this next one short. I got a question in from somebody asking very simply, what can go wrong when scientists lead the agenda and not patients?
What can go wrong? Yeah, I have visions of, there's a wonderful film from about the 60s, Dr. Strangelove, which had Peter Sellers in, which is all about the nuclear paranoia at the time, but it was a very good emphasis. And scientists were very much demonized at that time as being the source of all the wrongs and evils in the world, which is nonsense, of course. But I think my concern, and I think it's often manifested, particularly at the moment, in fact, is that scientists tend to operate as a group in the sense that once they discover a mechanism they believe is involved in say, Parkinson's, and the one that springs to mind is the alpha-synuclein story, that they tend to put all their eggs in one basket. Everybody goes after the same agenda, which I find unsettling, I have to say. I think back to the early 80s when all the work on MPTP started, and as a result of the addicts, drug addicts who'd poisoned themselves accidentally. And again, we followed that avenue and thought that it provided new insights into Parkinson's, and it did to a limited degree, but not the same kind of degree that justified the sort of pursuit of it by all the research groups around the world. So my concern is that it only takes a few strong voices in science to lead the whole group off following them in the wrong path.
So you had said that when you sort of reflect back, you would advise scientists to be a little bit different. What would you advise? I mean, you've talked about the medical student teaching, and you also talked about this sort of story of when you went into the GP and had this, he basically said, he said unlucky? Is that what he said to you at the end of?
Yeah.
This is, I guess, a two-part question. Sorry about these. I think Ben and I are really good at complex questions. But the first question would be, when you look back at those medical students, what would you advise them? Sort of, what's a nugget of truth or inspiration to them to try to keep sort of what you want them to focus on in place? Maybe that's the first question. The second question is, when thinking about that patient interaction, how would you have liked it to be a different interaction? Obviously, it wasn't that great. So I can repeat the second question after you're done the first one.
In answer to the first part, I think what I would say to medics is pay attention to body language, particularly with patients. We have a wonderful knack of saying one thing with our words and meaning something entirely different with our body language. I mean, as medical students, I'm sure that one of the classic things you're taught is the sort of door handle diagnosis, which for the patients who don't necessarily understand what that means, it's you go along to the doctor, you see the doctor, and you talk about a variety of things which may or may not be of relevance. And when the consultation is over, it's literally as you put your hand on the door, you say, "Oh, one other thing, doctor," which of course turns out to be exactly what you wanted to speak to the doctor about in the first place. So it's things like that, and trying to get patients to get to the point, I suppose I would say. Which the risk of sort of compromising the general civility of the exchange is still important to do in a modern world where we are constrained seriously by time for these consultations. That was the first part. Give me the second part again.
The second part was that I'll speak to just the first part that you said. I think that there is a civility and banter that's sort of expected, right? And I know, like, I have 3 kids, and my patients want to know, like, what are they all doing and how are they driving me crazy, these days or whatever. So there is a sort of need, and we also as clinicians love to, learn about your daughter's wedding or your such and such, your garden, the flowers that you brought me last time. How are they doing? So there is that sort of civility and the sort of bonding, which I think a lot of people really enjoy. And as somebody who's really been interested in social connection and loneliness as a topic recently, I've noticed just following along with the news that it seems like, honestly, when many patients go to the doctor, some of the reason is because they're actually lonely and they just want somebody to chat to. So how do we filter out, those people, and maybe they don't have to meet with the GP, they can meet with somebody else in the office to chat, or each other, in these sort of social prescribing mechanisms. And then how do we really sort of hone in on what is, the core reason that the patient is there, and sometimes we can talk about questionnaires, and, we mail you packages of stuff and you bring in like this much paper and we have like 2 seconds to go through it, and it still ends up being very formulaic, so I think, how to sort of chat around and build that rapport and really build the art of medicine, which is what I love as well, is sort of, how do you listen to a doctor that inspires you and take something from them and really, maybe, help your compliance with something or change your life in some ways. I think, there's been a very infrequent, I'm not going to tout my own whatever, but there are periodically things that you come across in a doctor-patient relationship. That's that aha moment where you're like, wow, this person didn't really trust me, or we've now sort of changed the dynamic. All of a sudden there's this new trust, or this new sort of like, we're on the same team. And then moving forward, it's really a different dynamic, and everything that happens from that moment on is actually quite magical, and it's sort of this sort of interesting thing that I don't know exactly how to describe. But the second question I had asked you earlier was about that sort of day of diagnosis by the primary care doctor, or your I don't know what you call it, GP, and when they said unlucky, how would you have envisioned that to have been better? It sounds like he wasn't too sure. He had a sense, he knew you a little bit, and then I don't know. Do you think that the words just slipped out of his mouth, or?
No. I think just to go back to the first part you were saying, and you mentioned one single word in the midst of that, which I think is exactly the issue with medicine. Medicine is a combination of science and art, and the art is the I think an equal part in it. It's not really taught in medical schools at all. But there's no question about it. I mean, my father, as I said, was a GP, but he was a very, very good diagnostician. And he had a knack of picking out a lot of the unsaid aspects of the discussion. But so I think art is very much a part of it. And how you teach that, goodness knows. And the second part, how I would envisage the interaction being different, I think was what you say. And I actually didn't have a problem with that. I mean, it's I suppose in a way I kind of enjoyed the directness of it. But yes, I did know the doctor quite well already. And he'd, in fact, when I was a scientist, he'd asked me on several occasions whether I would speak to the patient groups about Parkinson's. So we knew each other already fairly well. I think he also, interestingly, I don't want to malign him, but it seems to me there's a lot of medicine, and particularly at the GP level, is about certainties rather than doubts. And I get the impression I have over many years that my father reinforced this. You were encouraged to give a firm diagnosis, even if you weren't absolutely certain, because your confidence in that diagnosis, or your apparent confidence in that diagnosis, would somehow engender confidence in the patient and ensure that what you were saying was listened to. Science, on the other hand, it seems to me, is always about doubt. There are so many things you can say with confidence what the results of your own study mean, but how that you contextualize that is often a different matter. And any scientific paper is often couched in self-doubt and said that other interpretations might be X, Y, or Z. But medicine's not taught that. You're not invited to offer uncertainties to patients. You're invited to offer a clarity of thinking, even when it's necessary, possibly not justified. So I wouldn't say necessarily be more reticent about being so confident, because that sounds completely the wrong way around. But as you say, I think a rapport is certainly of value. But I remember one of my daughters diagnosing a thing called a cystic hygroma, which is incredibly rare. It's basically a cyst and underneath the jawline. He diagnosed this on the basis of himself and his torch, as it were shining a light through it. It refracts light. So the whole cheek lights up, and is how it is. And now we were then referred on to an ENT surgeon who just laughed and said, I haven't seen one in my professional career. It's highly unlikely the GP is going to ever see one. But again, we traded on certainties. So, but yep. In that case, misleading. That's a long way of not really answering your question, I suppose.
To pick up off of that, though, something that I think that I'm very drawn to in your character, and something that I think is a topic that I often think about, is just simply honesty and truth, and how honest we should be with ourselves, and how much we should be letting truth guide what we are doing. And there's a clip I want to play that Jon recently put together from a series called The Dark Side of Parkinson's. And it explores some of the more unseemly aspects of this disease, some of the topics that are not as often discussed, but are just as much a part of the truth of this disease as anything else. And I want to play a quick 2 minutes video from that series for the audience, so they can see a little bit more about what I'm talking about. Oh, hold on. one moment here. Jon, you can sing and dance for them while we wait.
We have a lot of great questions also that are sort of starting to happen here. So I can maybe ask one while Ben's getting set up. So one is actually from our go ahead.
The biggest problem with Parkinson's disease is not what people tell you, it's what they don't tell you. I see her every few months. She's a little girl, maybe 8. She has kind of a Victorian nightdress, I suppose. Dark, shadowy eyes, very pale complexion. And I see her usually in an attitude of prayer, almost. She has a neutral expression, never really smiles, never really frowns, certainly never speaks. I don't have a name for her. I've never given her a name. And why should I, of course? Because she's a hallucination. She's not real. And this is what the mind does when it's pushed by circumstances. Take a wild imagination, a lack of sleep, powerful drugs, and this is the result. I think this is grossly underreported. When you ask other people with Parkinson's confidentially to say whether they have hallucinations, the figure is much higher. Many more people say they have hallucinations when talking to a fellow person with Parkinson's than if they're talking to the medical profession. And it's understandable, I think, because hallucinations are so stigmatized. I think that we walk away from them. But the biggest worry often is that if you say you have hallucinations to your physician, there's a perception that you feel as though you're on the road to madness. We need to get to the bottom of this. We really do, because hallucinations are scary for people who have them, but they also need to be addressed. And we can only address that if we're honest about it and open. Most people suffer in silence.
And then to follow on top of that, I guess in your journey, at what point did you kind of clue into the fact that you needed to be very honest and open and truthful with yourself? And what, if you could give any general advice to people who are kind of early on in this journey, how much truth do you think, or how much of what is known about Parkinson's disease do you think someone should invest themselves of? How much should they delve into what's so quote unquote to come?
I think that's a very good question indeed. Another huge question, really. It's I suppose my background as a scientist has always focused me on what I believe to be truth. And it's and I always used to say to my students that when we tried to interpret data that we found, I always used to say to them that the data is truth. So the lies only come in when you start interpreting it, or the untruths, as it were, because there's the same data viewed with a different prism many years later, as it were, may yield an entirely different interpretation. So truth is an absolute, but it's unattainable at the same time. There are degrees of 50 shades of truth, as it were, and I think we have to rid ourselves of this notion of absolute truth. I do, however, believe in the context of Parkinson's that truth is a friend and an enemy. In my case, I was very keen. Once I became impatient with Parkinson's, I was very keen to learn as much as I could about it. In the same way that I'd focused on the synapses for some 20 odd years, I was then suddenly very interested in looking at the whole person and looking at the Parkinson's community as an organic entity in its own right. So in that respect, I was looking for, I suppose, a different component, a different part of truth. But that was very much the need for me. I needed more information and more truth, as it were, on the condition. For a lot of patients, I think they probably struggle with the idea of looking deeper into patients. I will often either embed themselves into Google and terrify themselves, or alternatively simply pull down the curtains and say, well, I don't want to have anything to do with this. I'll take the tablets and whatever, but that's as much interaction as I want with the condition. So I generally think that the truth is helpful rather than unhelpful. I think that the more one knows, the better equipped one is to deal with it. And I always used to say to newly diagnosed people with Parkinson's, when they ask for my opinion, rather, I don't tend to force it upon people anymore, but as I always used to say, you're as well to engage with your Parkinson's as soon as possible, because it's sure as hell going to engage with you.
So we have a few comments here from the audience, some on YouTube, which is cool. Somebody said powerful video. There's been some sense that you've really brought some things out here in terms of questions around optimism and truth and things like that. So Megan, who was on last week, who's a researcher, Dr. Duffy, had said, you alluded to the uncertainty of science when it comes to drawing conclusions about the work versus how we present it to patients. Any advice on how scientists can balance optimism with reality when talking to patient groups? And I think that almost is a similar question in some ways with clinicians as well. We are, often feel like we're in the role of a cheerleader, trying to keep, sort of hope. And, but, we're also sometimes giving bad news and having to give, realities. And it's a very big balance. And I think I struggle with that. I know Sarah Lidstone, who came on 2 weeks ago, had said that, she cries with patients and she's really very, real and emotionally present, but that wasn't something that we were really taught in medical school. I think we were taught to, like you said, sometimes represent, clarity of diagnosis, even if we're not sure, be bold, be sort of somewhat distant from the patient emotionally. There's sort of this persona that I don't know where that got created in maybe a paternalistic sort of model of medicine, where the doctor is here and the patient comes in and asks questions, we're supposed to have the answers. But I think, similarly with research scientists, when they're presenting, there's so much that's unknown. What is the truth? What is optimism? What's the balance? Maybe you could kind of speak to that arena. And I know there's not all the right answers anyway, but we'd love to hear your opinion.
I'm not sure that I have a particularly strong opinion on this. As you say, I think training scientists in their interactions with patients, in many respects, scientists don't much have direct interactions with patients as often as not, unless they're working in a very clinical area. It's one of the things that was a revelation to me relatively early on in my diagnosis. I was diagnosed in 2006, and after a couple of years of really just feeling sorry for myself, I kind of got my act together and went to the World Parkinson Congress in 2010, and that was an absolute revelation to me, to be honest, because there were a group of clinicians there were groups of scientists there, and there were groups of patients, and it was like a circus, to be perfectly honest. It was quite wonderful. You had patients wandering around batting, with basketballs or whatever to cue their walking and things like this, and then dressed as though for the beach, and then you'd have clinicians in suits and ties and things, and it was just a wonderful sort of melee of people. But it did actually, although it was a little contrived, I think at the beginning, it very much got people talking to each other, and you would have conversations in the coffee queues and with scientists talking to patients that and it was, as I said, a revelation for them. So I think, communication is unquestionably the way forward, and those kind of forums or fora, really, sorry, is Latin there, are the kind of environment where I think this interaction does occur. And it's, but in terms of how one specifically would encapsulate that, I'm not sure I could say very much more on that, really.
Another topic that we often talk about is the dividing line, kind of, so to speak, between a patient advocate, and a patient activist. And I wonder if you could take a moment to elaborate a little bit on the differences between them. And if you would, what advice you would give to a patient that's hoping to make more connections with scientists?
Gosh, these are awfully big questions.
We can get back to the cricket questions later if you want.
Yeah, I was going to say I can answer questions on cricket. No, these are very good questions indeed. The boundaries are blurred. There are no exams that one passes to become a patient advocate or a patient activist. I think it's, as much as anything else, determined by the condition. In terms of advocacy, I always think you have to start out with a patient with an illness that and this is going to sound awfully cold, but you have to start out with an illness where you're going to live long enough to make it for it to make a difference. And ideally, you want an illness that's not going to be catastrophic. You want an illness that's going to be gradual and progressive. So, in many respects, Parkinson's fits that bill very, very neatly. In terms of, say, some of the malignancies and things like that, the progression of the illness is often so fast that advocacy really is immaterial. You just haven't got the time for it. And equally much other conditions, I'm not going to name individual conditions, but conditions where the progression isn't with any great severity, I think also don't make a strong case for advocacy. Parkinson's is almost a model illness in that respect. We deteriorate over a number of years. We have the opportunity, and our cognition doesn't go until pretty late on. So we have a wonderful opportunity to become advocates and activists. Where I would draw the boundary between advocacy and activism is simply advocacy. I think is as much as anything else about awareness, I suppose, of the condition, and a lot of people would stop there, for instance, and say that making people aware of Parkinson's, a little more about the symptoms and things, is what advocacy is about. If you go further than that, to my mind, advocacy, the upper end of advocacy and going into activism, is very much about making change. It's not so much about raising awareness, but it's actually enforcing and instigating change in the way Parkinson's is treated, the way it's managed, the way it's understood. So I suppose I would regard that as being very much activism. Again, it's probably a slightly circumlocuted way of answering your question.
So I have another question here to change tack a little bit. It's from Debbie in the chat. One concern that arises in PD support groups is researchers' emphasis on pharmaceutical solutions. And we have been pleased to see more inquiry into actions and practices that patients can take to slow the progression of PD, nutritional tips, exercise, et cetera, and empower themselves. Have you noticed this change, and what do you think about it? I'll let you answer that, but people have also asked, what are some tips that you have for a newly diagnosed Parkinson's patient? Maybe you could comment sort of on if this sort of empowerment piece as well around these questions.
I think there's no question that the empowerment is an important part of it. We know, and also having, I would say, a positive outlook. I mean, there are plenty of studies, not just in Parkinson's, but in other conditions, that suggest that positivity is, whether necessarily feigned or otherwise, but is beneficial and is associated with better outcomes generally and better quality of life. Pretty much all the quality of life scales show that if you have a positive outlook, then you'll progress more slowly, and progress is a wonderful word. I was thinking it's a very positive word in everything except Parkinson's, where progression is actually what you don't want in the condition. You actually want stasis rather than progression. It's in terms of things you can actually do for yourself, and I'm the worst practitioner of all in that arena, but there's no question that diet and exercise are very definitely beneficial. I mean, we don't even need to to do the studies anymore because the data is already so persuasive. There are probably things. A lot of people talk about meditation, particularly. I don't practice it myself, but I'm aware that a number of people do use meditation and mindfulness generally, and find that helpful. But certainly diet and exercise. And in terms of exercise, I always thought the very simple rule is the best exercise is the exercise you actually do. It's all very well having running pads and things like this and all sorts of paraphernalia at home, but if you're not going to do it, it doesn't matter how much equipment you've got. But if you are prepared to just go for a little run every couple of days, then if that's something you'll do, then you'll benefit from it. And the same goes with diet. I mean, and as I said, I'm the worst offender in that respect. I can see a pizza box from where I'm sat now. But equally much, I do know that that's the wrong tack to take. So I would say do what I say rather than what I do. I would say.
I have a slightly personal question to ask you. Well, not that personal, but in regards to our advocacy and our activism. About 2 years ago, you and I were attending along with a friend of ours, were invited to attend a conference of scientists in Switzerland for 3 days, where we were the only patients in the crowd, and it was a very science-heavy conference. And I feel, thinking back on that, I feel like we had a very positive impact. I feel like we made an impression on the people that were attending. I feel like we left a lasting impression. But I can't help feeling like we could have done more, that we could have maybe done more to push the patient agenda a little bit further. I don't know how much those scientists reflect on what we told them. I don't know how much they changed their practice afterwards. When you think back on that, is there anything that you think we should have done differently?
Yes, very definitely. It's I know we're talking about the same conference, but it's the main thing I think we should have done differently is that we should have taken over the timetable rather than acted on their timetable. I mean, in fairness, the conference itself was a big improvement on most conferences at that time, where patients wouldn't be involved at all. So the fact that there were three of us involved there was valuable, and I have no doubt that the conference organizer took on board a lot of what we said, but it was very much a timetabled slot, and it was towards the end of the conference where we were brought on and invited to comment on a variety of things. And with hindsight, I think what we should have done, what we should have been allowed to do, was actually to have a comment pretty much throughout the sessions. And ideally, we should have been the first people on at the beginning of the conference and said, this is our agenda, now let's see how you match up to it. That sounds awfully arrogant, but I honestly think that it's not so much arrogant. I think it's the way in which patients have to ultimately think. I think we have to think in terms of driving the agenda rather than trying to match the agenda, if you see what I mean.
Absolutely. I think that that's part of the discussion. I think that has to be the way, is to make sure that you're part of creating the agenda together, maybe is the important way, but not to just be fit in. And as somebody who often gets the last slot on the last day of meetings, talking about either palliative care or yoga and Parkinson's, I'm there with you. So I think, trying to reframe the agenda, but often the agenda is driven by sometimes pharmaceutical companies or device making companies or other organizations. So I think it's just part of, again, getting back to that system and how we're driving these meetings in the first place, and who's paying for them. It's sort of sad to say, but a question here about, you had apparently talked about low-hanging fruit for researchers, is what Kelly's saying, or from you, somebody from YouTube is saying. Do you have a sense of, can you elaborate on that? What does that mean, the low-hanging fruit for researchers?
I think it's what I meant by that was that in terms of the easy targets, it's in terms of objectives of research. From my point of view, when I talk to patients, other patients, the areas that are of particular interest to them are obviously a cure for Parkinson's. I don't think any of us would ever walk away from that. I think that we're certainly interested in that, but obviously a cure is potentially going to be many, many different things in any case. But also what we're interested in is some way of slowing the progression down, so bringing it to a standstill. And I don't think that's an unrealistic objective. But what I think of many of the drug companies still find themselves bound by is this notion of a market share. So they're always looking for drugs that into recognized market areas. And these therapeutic areas may not be of particular interest, I think, to patients. I mean, drugs that reduce tremor are certainly worthwhile, but do we need another one? You ask yourself really whether the research on, say, tremor is being driven by a need to make money from the pharmaceutical companies. And don't get me wrong, this is not a way of demonizing the pharmaceutical industry. I think without it, we would be in a pretty dire situation. But at the same time, I think they're very much driven by what's easy. And if there's an area which already has drugs, then proven drugs, you don't have to prove the purpose again. It's already done. So it's very much low-hanging fruit. It's the easy targets rather than the more difficult ones. I think neuroprotection, I think, is going to be well, I say it's going to be the way forward. I think it already is, from a patient stance, the biggest target, the biggest realistic target. And I actually don't think it'll be long before we have drugs that are making a serious difference in that area. But at the same time, that requires much more investment in both time and research.
We're coming close soon to the top of the hour, and I wanted to kind of make sure we ended on a slightly more optimistic note, or just make sure we steer this towards optimism. I wonder if you could reflect a little bit on the positive changes you've seen over the course of your time in advocacy, and what are you most hopeful for going forward?
It's, I mean, I would hate to get the impression that I'm very negative about research and about the research community and the patient community. I'm actually not at all. I'm very optimistic about it, and I think I always used to end lectures which I gave on Parkinson's when we would discuss drugs and treatment of Parkinson's. I always used to say, you have to remember that the drugs we have now and the treatments we have now are better than they were 5 years ago. And in 5 years' time, they're going to be better still. And the truth is, whether we envisage it or not in terms of drug treatment or in terms of patient response, the truth is that there's actually never been a better time to have Parkinson's than now. Obviously, the best time is not to have Parkinson's at all, but if you must have it, then have it now. So I actually do feel very positive. I do feel that drug companies are beginning to engage with patients much more and in different ways, so that rather than having patients dragged along to advisory boards to simply comment and listen and gratefully receive the deliberations of the scientists and clinicians, patients are being invited to give their thoughts much earlier on in the process. So I think that conference that we attended a couple of years back actually has influenced certainly me in terms of how I would advise scientific conferences to engage with patients, and also research institutions as well. And so my message is really very much, you should be the first thing you should think about is patients when you're designing a research plan. The second thing you should think about is patients. The third thing you should think about is patients. You have to try and look through a patient's eyes. And if you do that, I don't think you'll go far wrong.
That's amazing. I mean, I think this chat's been amazing, and we have a few minutes left. I'd also like to find out from you, as somebody who's been sort of around a number of patients and has been living in your own body with this experience, what are the things that I think you think are sort of the secret sauce to success for a person? What would you say you've noticed in people that tend to do better? And also, what are the things that you try to, and I know you said you listen to what you say and not what you do, but I've noticed just in our interactions, a sense of humor, certainly a social interaction with, people like Ben, and keeping the camaraderie up. Sounds like you may play cricket or watch cricket or get out and do this sort of team building spirit. So those are some things that I've noticed, but what are sort of your secret sauce sort of suggestions?
It's again, these very tough questions. This is like a job interview, I tell you. It's
you got the job. Don't worry, you're hired.
We're dealing with some very, very big issues. From my point of view, and I can only give you a personal account. I mean, for me, sense of humor is probably above anything else. And I'm not saying I have a great sense of humor, but I'm saying the ability to find humor in circumstances is I think vital. I remember when I was only diagnosed a couple of years, and my kids very much used to find it funny, and so I'll give you an example. We were having spaghetti one evening, and the kids were absolutely actually had a video recorder with them, and they were discreetly filming me sort of eating spaghetti. So I put out my plate of spaghetti and reached for the parmesan to grate it over it, and had a spectacular tremors at this point. So one minute it was a plate of spaghetti, and then the next minute it looked like a snowflake nativity scene, really, more than anything. And I think my kids have always kept me grounded. My son, for instance, really has not really, says he can actually hardly remember me before Parkinson's. My daughters, on the other hand, are a little bit older, and so they've witnessed the process. But they are very different to keep me grounded. They don't allow me to wallow in self-pity, and I think they make sure that there's a funny side to everything. And sometimes they go too far, but I don't mind that. I think an ability to laugh at yourself, I think, is absolutely vital. And I said there will be other people who laugh at you as well, but not necessarily in the same way. But a sense of humor is I think, the single most vital aspect of all aspects of long-term illness. To be honest, Parkinson's particularly gives you enough scope.
Absolutely. Well, I think these are all very wise words. I think we've heard some amazing thoughts on advocacy, activism, communication, teaching, each other about what really matters, keeping patients, at the forefront, and then keeping a sense of humor, which we really enjoy. Ben and I laugh about things as well all the time. So I think, we'll take all of these words to heart. Thank you so much, Ben, for bringing us, Professor Stamford here. He's an amazing researcher and just an amazing human being. So I've learned a lot. Hopefully we've tried this YouTube thing as well out there, and hopefully YouTube Live has worked well. We'd love to hear your feedback about how this YouTube thing went as well. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. And I'll pass it back to Andrea for our wave goodbye.
Yes, as many of our repeat viewers know, we always end with a little goodbye moment of eye contact and smiles. So I invite you to turn on your camera and show your gratitude for all of our amazing speakers, and bravo, they're great questions, great discussion today. Thank you so much, and have a great day, everyone.